Relax and listen to the voice. Ole-Luk-Oie, the dream god. There is nobody in the world who knows so many stories as Ole-Luk-Oie, or who can relate them so nicely. In the evening, while the children are seated at the table or in their little chairs, he comes up the stairs very softly, for he walks in his socks. Then he opens the doors without the slightest noise and throws a small quantity of very fine dust into their eyes, just enough to prevent them from keeping them open, and so that they do not see him. Then he creeps behind them and blows softly upon their necks until their heads begin to droop. But Ole-Luk-Oie does not wish to hurt them, for he is very fond of children and only wants them to be quiet that he may relate to them pretty stories, and they never are quiet until they are in bed and asleep. As soon as they are asleep, Ole-Luk-Oie seats himself upon the bed. He is nicely dressed. His coat is made of silken stuff. It is impossible to say of what color, for it changes from green to red, and from red to blue as he turns from side to side. Under each arm he carries an umbrella. One of them, with pictures on the inside, he spreads over the good children, and then they dream the most beautiful stories the whole night. But the other umbrella has no pictures, and this he holds over the naughty children, so that they sleep heavily and wake in the morning without having dreamed at all. Now we shall hear how Ole-Luk-Oie came every night during a whole week to the little boy named Hjalmar and what he told him. There were 7 stories, as there are 7 days in the week. Monday. "Now pay attention," said Ole-Luk-Oie in the evening when Hjalmar was in bed, "and I will decorate the room." Immediately, all the flowers in the flower pots became large trees, with long branches reaching to the ceiling and stretching along the walls so that the whole room was like a greenhouse. All the branches were loaded with flowers. Each flower as beautiful and as fragrant as a rose, and had anyone tasted them, he would have found them sweeter even than jam. The fruit glittered like gold, and there were cakes so full of plums that they were nearly bursting. It was incomparably beautiful. At the same time sounded dismal moans from the table drawer in which lay Hjalmar's school books. "What can that be now?" said Ole-Luk-Oie, going to the table and pulling out the drawer. It was a slate, in such distress because of a false number in the sum that it had almost broken itself to pieces. The pencil pulled and tugged at its strings as if it were a little dog that wanted to help but could not. And then came a moan from Hjalmar's copybook. Oh, it was quite terrible to hear. On each leaf stood a row of capital letters, every one having a small letter by its side. This formed a copy. Under these were other letters which Hjalmar had written. They fancied they looked like the copy, but they were mistaken, for they were leaning on one side as if they intended to fall over the pencil lines.
"See, this is the way you should hold yourselves,"
said the copy.
"Look here, you should slope thus with a graceful curve."
"Oh, we are very willing to do so, but we cannot,"
said Hjalmar's letters.
"We are so rigidly made." "You must be stretched out then,"
said Ole-Luk-Oie.
"Oh no!"
they cried, and then they stood up so gracefully it was quite a pleasure to look at them.
"Now we must give up our stories and exercise these letters,"
said Ole-Luk-Oie.
1, 2, 1, 2.
So he drilled them until they stood up gracefully and looked as beautiful as a copy could look. But after Ole-Luk-Oie was gone, and Hjalmar looked at them in the morning, they were as wretched and as awkward as ever. Tuesday. As soon as Hjalmar was in bed, Ole-Luk-Oie touched, with his little magic wand, all the furniture in the room, which immediately began to chatter, and each article only talked of itself. Over the chest of drawers hung a large picture in a gilt frame representing a landscape with fine old trees, flowers in the grass, and a broad stream which flowed through the wood past several castles far out into the wild ocean. Ole-Luk-Oie touched the picture with his magic wand, and immediately the birds commenced singing, the branches of the trees rustled, and the clouds moved across the sky, casting their shadows on the landscape beneath them. Then Ole-Luk-Oie lifted little Hjalmar up to the frame and placed his feet in the picture, just on the high grass, and there he stood with the sun shining down upon him through the branches of the trees. He ran to the water and seated himself in a little boat which lay there, and which was painted red and white. The sails glittered like silver, and 6 swans, each with a golden circlet round its neck, and a bright blue star on its forehead, drew the boat past the green wood, where the trees talked of robbers and witches, and the flowers of beautiful little elves and fairies, whose histories the butterflies had related to them. Brilliant fish with scales like silver and gold swam after the boat, sometimes making a spring and splashing the water around them, while birds, red and blue, small and great, flew after him in 2 long lines. The gnats danced round them, and the cockchafers cried, "Buzz, buzz." They all wanted to follow Hjalmar, and all had some story to tell him. It was a most pleasant sail. Sometimes the forests were thick and dark, sometimes like a beautiful garden, gay with sunshine and flowers. And then he passed great palaces of glass and of marble, and on the balconies stood princesses, whose faces were those of little girls whom Hjalmar knew well and had often played with. One of them held out her hand, in which was a heart made of sugar, more beautiful than any confectioner ever sold. As Hjalmar sailed by, he caught hold of one side of the sugar heart and held it fast, and the princess held fast also, so that it broke in 2 pieces. Hjalmar had one piece, and the princess the other, but Hjalmar's was the largest. At each castle stood little princes acting as sentinels. They presented arms and had golden swords and made it rain plums and tin soldiers, so they must have been real princes. Hjalmar continued to sail, sometimes through woods, sometimes as if it were through large halls, and then by large cities. At last he came to the town where his nurse lived, who had carried him in her arms when he was a very little boy, and had always been kind to him. She nodded and beckoned to him, and then sang the little verses she had herself composed and set to him. How oft my memory turns to thee, my own Hjalmar, ever dear. When I could watch thy infant glee, or kiss away a pearly tear. 'Twas in my arms thy lisping tongue first spoke the half-remembered word, while o'er thy tottering steps I hung, my fond protection to afford. Farewell! I pray the heavenly power to keep thee till thy dying hour. And all the birds sang the same tune, the flowers danced on their stems, and the old trees nodded as if Ole-Luk-Oie had been telling them stories as well. Wednesday. How the rain did pour down! Hjalmar could hear it in his sleep, and when Ole-Luk-Oie opened the window, the water flowed quite up to the window-sill. It had the appearance of a large lake outside, and a beautiful ship lay close to the house.
Wilt thou sail with me tonight, little Hjalmar? Said Ole-Luk-Oie. Then we shall see foreign countries, and thou shalt return here in the morning.
All in a moment, there stood Hjalmar in his best clothes on the deck of the noble ship, and immediately the weather became fine. They sailed through the streets, round by the church, and on every side rolled the wide, great sea. They sailed until the land had disappeared, and then they saw a flock of storks who had left their own country and were traveling to warmer climates. The storks flew one behind the other and had already been a long, long time on the wing. One of them seemed so tired that his wings could scarcely carry him. He was the last of the row, and was soon left very far behind. At length he sunk lower and lower with outstretched wings, flapping them in vain, till his feet touched the rigging of the ship, and he slided from the sails to the deck, and stood before them. Then a sailor boy caught him, and put him in the hen-house with the fowls, the ducks, and the turkeys, while the poor stork stood quite bewildered amongst them.
Just look at that fellow,
said the chickens. Then the turkey-cock puffed himself out as large as he could, and inquired who he was, and the ducks waddled backwards, crying,
quack, 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 quack.
Then the stork told them all about warm Africa, of the pyramids, and of the ostrich, which, like a wild horse, runs across the desert. But the ducks did not understand what he said, and quacked amongst themselves.
Quack, we are all of the same opinion, quack, namely, quack, quack, that he is stupid.
Yes, to be sure he is stupid,
said the turkey-cock, and gobbled. Then the stork remained quite silent, and thought of his home in Africa.
Those are handsome thin legs of yours, said the turkey-cock. What do they cost a yard?
Quack, 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 quack.
The ducks grinned and quacked, but the stork pretended not to hear.
You may as well laugh, said the turkey, for that remark was rather witty, or perhaps it was above you. Is he not clever? He will be a great amusement to us while he remains here.
And then he gobbled, and the ducks quacked.
Quack, 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 quack.
What a terrible uproar they made while they were having such fun amongst themselves. Then Hjalmar went to the hen-house, and opening the door, called to the stork. Then he hopped out on the deck. He had rested himself now, and he looked happy, and seemed as if he nodded to Hjalmar as to thank him. Then he spread his wings and flew away to warmer countries, while the hens clucked, the ducks quacked, and the turkey-cock turned quite scarlet in the head.
Tomorrow you shall be made into soup,
said Hjalmar to the fowls, and then he awoke, and found himself lying in his little bed. It was a wonderful journey which Ole-Luk-Oie had made him take this night. Thursday.
What do you think I have got here?
Said Ole-Luk-Oie.
Do not be frightened, and you shall see a little mouse.
And then he held out his hand to him, in which lay a lovely little creature.
It has come to invite you to a wedding. 2 little mice are going to enter into the marriage state tonight. They reside under the floor of your mother's storeroom, and that must be a fine dwelling place.
But how can I get through the little mouse hole in the floor?
Asked Hjalmar.
Leave me to manage that, said Ole-Luk-Oie. I will soon make you small enough.
And then he touched Hjalmar with his magic wand, whereupon he became less and less, until at last He was no longer than a little finger.
Now you can borrow the dress of the tin soldier. I think it will just fit you. It looks well to wear a uniform when you go into company.
Yes, certainly,
said Hjalmar, and in a moment he was dressed as neatly as the neatest of all tin soldiers.
Will you be so good as to seat yourself in your mamma's thimble,
said the little mouse,
that I may have the pleasure of drawing you to the wedding? Will you really take so much trouble, young lady?
said Hjalmar. And so in this way he rode to the mouse's wedding. First they went under the floor, and then passed through a long passage, which was scarcely high enough to allow the thimble to drive under, and the whole passage was lit up with the phosphorescent light of rotten wood.
Does it not smell delicious?
asked the mouse as she drew him along.
The wall and the floor have been smeared with bacon rind. Nothing can be nicer.
Very soon they arrived at the bridal hall. On the right stood all the little lady mice, whispering and giggling, as if they were making game of each other. To the left were the gentleman mice, stroking their whiskers with their forepaws, and in the center of the hall could be seen the bridal pair, standing side by side in a hollow cheese rind and kissing each other while all eyes were upon them, for they had already been betrothed and were soon to be married. More and more friends kept arriving until the mice were nearly treading each other to death, for the bridal pair now stood in the doorway and none could pass in or out. The room had been rubbed over with bacon rind, like the passage, which was all the refreshment offered to the guests. But for dessert, they produced a pea on which a mouse belonging to the bridal pair had bitten the first letters of their names. This was something quite uncommon. All the mice said that it was a very beautiful wedding, and that they had been very agreeably entertained. After this, Hjalmar returned home. He had certainly been in a grand society, but he had been obliged to creep under a room and to make himself small enough to wear the uniform of a tin soldier. Friday.
It is incredible how many old people there are who would be glad to have me at night,
said Ole-Luk-Oie.
Especially those who have done something wrong. Good little Ole, say they to me, we cannot close our eyes, and we lie awake the whole night and see all of our evil deeds sitting on our beds like little imps and sprinkling us with hot water. Will you come and drive them away, that we may have a good night's rest? And then they sigh so deeply and say, we would gladly pay you for it. Good night, Ole-Luk. The money lies on the window. But I never do anything for gold.
What shall we do tonight?
asked Hjalmar.
I do not know whether you would care to go to another wedding, he replied, although it is quite a different affair to the one we saw last night. Your sister's large doll that is dressed like a man and is called Herman intends to marry the doll named Bertha. It is also the doll's birthday, and they will receive many presents.
Yes, I know that already,
said Hjalmar.
My sister always allows her dolls to keep their birthdays or to have a wedding when they require new clothes. That has happened already 100 times, I'm quite sure.
Yes, so it may, but tonight is the 101st wedding, and when that has taken place, it must be the last. Therefore, this time is to be extremely beautiful. Only look."
Hjalmar looked at the table, and there stood the little cardboard doll's house, with lights in all the windows, and drawn up before it were the tin soldiers presenting arms. The bridal pair were seated on the floor, leaning against the leg of a table, looking very thoughtful, and with good reason. Then Ole-Luk-Oie dressed up in grandmother's black gown and married them. As soon as the ceremony was concluded, all the furniture in the room joined in singing a beautiful song, which had been composed by the lead pencil, and which went to the melody of a military tattoo.
"What merry sounds are on the wind as marriage rites together bind, a quiet and a loving pair, though formed of kid yet smooth and fair. Hurrah! If they are deaf and blind, we'll sing through weather prove unkind."
And now came the present, but the bridal pair had nothing to eat, for love was to be their food.
"Shall we go to a country house or travel?"
asked the bridegroom. Then they consulted the swallow who had traveled so far, and the old hen in the yard who had brought up 5 broods of chickens. And the swallow talked to them of warm countries where the grapes hang in large clusters on the vines, and the air is soft and mild, and about the mountains, glowing with colors more beautiful than we can think of.
"But they have no red cabbage like we have,"
said the hen.
"I was once in the country with my chickens for a whole summer. There was a large sand pit in which we could walk about and scratch as we liked. Then we got into a garden in which grew red cabbage. Oh, how nice it was! I cannot think of anything more delicious."
"But one cabbage stalk is exactly like another," said the swallow.
"And here we have often bad weather." "Yes, but we are accustomed to it,"
said the hen.
"But it is so cold here, and freezes sometimes." "Cold weather is good for cabbages,"
said the hen.
"Besides, we do have it warm here sometimes. 4 years ago, we had a summer that lasted more than 5 weeks, and it was so hot one could scarcely breathe. And then, in this country, we have no poisonous animals, and we are free from robbers. He must be wicked who does not consider our country the finest of all lands. He ought not to be allowed to live here."
And then the hen wept very much and said,
"I have also traveled. I once went 12 miles in a coop, and it was not a pleasant traveling at all." "The hen is a sensible woman,"
said the doll Bertha.
"I don't care for traveling over mountains, just to go up and come down again. No, let us go to the sand pit in the front of the gate, and then take a walk in the cabbage garden."
And so they settled it. Saturday.
"Am I to hear any more stories?"
asked little Hjalmar as soon as Ole-Luk-Oie had sent him to sleep.
"We shall have no time this evening,"
said he, spreading out his prettiest umbrella over the child.
"Look at these Chinese!"
And then the whole umbrella appeared like a large china bowl, with blue trees and pointed bridges, upon which stood little Chinamen nodding their heads.
"We must make all the world beautiful for tomorrow morning," said Ole-Luk-Oie, "for it will be a holiday. It is Sunday. I must now go to the church steeple and see if the little sprites who live there have polished the bells so that they may sound ever so sweetly. And then I must go into the fields and see if the wind has blown the dust from the grass and the leaves. And the most difficult task of all which I have to do is to take down all the stars and brighten them up. I have to number them first before I put them in my apron, and also to number the places from which I take them, so that they may go back into the right holes, or else they would not remain, and we should have a number of falling stars, for they would all tumble down one after the other. "Hark ye, Mr. Logoy," said an old portrait which hung on the wall of Hjalmar's bedroom. "Do you know me? I am Hjalmar's great-grandfather. I thank you for telling the boy stories, but you must not confuse his ideas. The stars cannot be taken down from the sky and polished. They are like spheres, like our earth, which is a good thing for them." "Thank you, old great-grandfather," said Ole-Luk-Oie. "I thank you. You may be the head of the family, as no doubt you are, but I am older than you. I am an ancient heathen. The old Romans and Greeks named me the Dream God. I have visited the noblest houses, and continue to do so. Still I know how to conduct myself, both to high and low. And now you may tell the stories yourself." And so Ole-Luk-Oie walked off, taking his umbrellas with him. "Well, well, one is never to give an opinion, I suppose," grumbled the portrait, and it woke Hjalmar. Sunday. "Good evening," said Ole-Luk-Oie. Hjalmar nodded, and then sprang out of bed, and turned his great-grandfather's portrait to the wall, so that it might not interrupt them as it had done yesterday.
"Now,"
said he,
"you must tell me some stories about 5 green peas that lived in one pod, or of the chickseed that courted the chickweed, or of the darning needle who acted so proudly because she fancied herself an embroidery needle."
"You may have too much of a good thing," said Ole-Luk-Oie. "You know that I like best to show you something, so I will show you my brother. He is also called Ole-Luk-Oie, but he never visits anyone but once, and when he does come, he takes him away on his horse and tells him stories as they ride along. He only knows 2 stories. One of these is so wonderfully beautiful that no one in the world can imagine anything at all like it. But the other is just as ugly and frightful, so that it would be impossible to describe it."
Then Ole-Luk-Oie lifted Hjalmar up to the window.
"There now, you can see my brother, the other Ole-Luk-Oie. He is also called Death. You perceive he is not so bad as they represent him in picture books. There he is a skeleton, but now his coat is embroidered with silver, and he wears the splendid uniform of a hussar, and the mantle of black velvet flies behind him over the horse. Look how he gallops along."
Hjalmar saw that as this Ole-Luk-Oie rode on, he lifted up old and young, and carried them away on his horse. Some he seated in front of him, and some behind, but always inquired first, How stands the mark book? Good, they all answered. Yes, but let me see for myself, he replied, and they were obliged to give him the books. Then all of those who had very good or exceedingly good came in front of the horse and heard the beautiful story, while those who had middling or tolerably good in their books were obliged to sit behind and listen to the frightful tale. They trembled and cried and wanted to jump down from the horse, but they could not get free, for they seemed fastened to the seat.
Why, Death is a most splendid Luke-Oie,
said Hjalmar.
I am not in the least afraid of him.
You need have no fear of him,
said old Luke-Oie,
if you take care and keep a good conduct book. Now, I call that very instructive,
murmured the great-grandfather's portrait.
It is useful sometimes to express an opinion.
So he was quite satisfied. These are some of the doings and sayings of Ole-Luk-Oie. I hope he may visit you himself this evening and relate some more. The Nightingale. In China, you know, the emperor is Chinese, and all those about him are Chinese also. The story I'm going to tell you happened a great many years ago, so it is well to hear it now before it is forgotten. The emperor's palace was the most beautiful in the world. It was built entirely of porcelain and very costly, but so delicate and brittle that whoever touched it was obliged to be careful. In the garden could be seen the most singular flowers, with pretty silver bells tied to them, which tinkled so that everyone who passed could not help noticing the flowers. Indeed, everything in the emperor's garden was remarkable, and it extended so far that the gardener himself did not know where it ended. Those who traveled beyond its limits knew that there was a noble forest with lofty trees sloping down to the deep blue sea, and the great ships sailed under the shadow of its branches. In one of these trees lived a nightingale who sang so beautifully that even the poor fishermen, who had so many other things to do, would stop and listen. Sometimes, when they went at night to spread their nets, they would hear her sing and say, "Oh, is that not beautiful?" But when they returned to their fishing, they forgot the bird until the next night. Then they would hear it again and exclaim, "Oh, how beautiful is that nightingale's song!" Travelers from every country in the world came to the city of the emperor, which they admired very much, as well as the palace and the gardens. But when they heard the nightingale, they all declared it to be the best of all. And the travelers, on their return home, related what they had seen, and learned men wrote books containing descriptions of the town, the palace, and the gardens, but they did not forget the nightingale, which was really the greatest wonder. And those who could write poetry composed beautiful verses about the nightingale, who lived in a forest near the deep sea. The books traveled all over the world, and some of them came into the hands of the emperor, and he sat in his golden chair, and, as he read, he nodded his approval every moment, for it pleased him to find such a beautiful description of his city, his palace, and his gardens. But when he came to the words, "The nightingale is the most beautiful of all," he exclaimed,
What is this? I know nothing of any nightingale.
Is there such a bird in my empire, and even in my garden? I've never heard of it. Something, it appears, may be learnt from books." Then he called one of his lords-in-waiting, who was so high-bred that when any in an inferior rank to himself spoke to him or asked him a question, he would answer, "Pooh," which means nothing. "There is a very wonderful bird mentioned here, called a nightingale," said the emperor. "They say it's the best thing in my large kingdom. Why have I not been told of it?" "I have never heard the name," replied the cavalier. "She has not been presented at court." "It is my pleasure that she shall appear this evening," said the emperor. "The whole world knows what I possess better than I do myself." "I have never heard of her," said the cavalier. "Yet I will endeavor to find her." But where was the nightingale to be found? The nobleman went upstairs and down, through halls and passages, yet none of those who he met had heard of the bird. So he returned to the emperor and said that it must be a fable, invented by those who had written the book. "Your Imperial Majesty," said he, "cannot believe everything contained in books. Sometimes they are only fiction, or what is called the black art." "But the book in which I have read this account," said the emperor, "was sent to me by the great and mighty Emperor of Japan, and therefore it cannot contain a falsehood. I will hear the nightingale. She must be here this evening. She has my highest favor, and if she does not come, the whole court shall be trampled upon after supper is ended."
"Sing P!"
cried the lord-in-waiting, and again he ran up and down the stairs, through all the halls and corridors, and half the court ran with him, for they did not like the idea of being trampled upon. There was a great inquiry about this wonderful nightingale, whom all the world knew, but who was unknown to the court. At last they met with a poor little girl in the kitchen, who said,
"Oh yes, I know the nightingale quite well. Indeed, she can sing. Every evening I have permission to take home to my poor sick mother the scraps from the table. She lives down by the seashore, and as I come back I feel tired, and I sit down in the wood to rest and listen to the nightingale's song. Then the tears come into my eyes, and it is just as if my mother kissed me."
"Little maiden," said the lord-in-waiting, "I will obtain for you constant employment in the kitchen, and you shall have permission to see the emperor dine, if you will lead us to the nightingale, for she is invited for this evening to the palace." So she went into the wood where the nightingale sang, and half the court followed her. As they went along, a cow began lowing. "Oh," said a young courtier, "now we have found her. What wonderful power for such a small creature! I have certainly heard it before."
"No, that is only a cow lowing,"
said the little girl.
"We are a long way from the place yet."
And then some frogs began to croak in the marsh. "Beautiful," said the young courtier again. "Now I hear it, tinkling like little church bells."
"No, those are frogs,"
said the little maiden.
"but I think we shall soon hear her now."
And presently the nightingale began to sing.
"Hark, hark, there she is,"
said the little girl.
"and there she sits,"
she added, pointing to a little gray bird who was perched on a bough. "Is it possible?" said the lord-in-waiting. "I never imagined it would be a little, plain, simple thing like that. She has certainly changed color
at seeing so many grand people around her."
Little Nightingale, little Nightingale,
cried the girl, raising her voice.
our most gracious Emperor wishes you to sing before him. With the greatest pleasure,
said the nightingale, and began to sing most delightfully.
"It sounds like tiny glass bells,"
said the lord-in-waiting.
"and see how her little throat works. It is surprising that we have never heard this before. She will be a great success at court."
Shall I sing once more before the Emperor?
asked the nightingale, who thought he was present.
"My excellent little nightingale," said the courtier,
"I have the great pleasure of inviting you to a court festival this evening, where you will gain imperial favor by your charming song."
My song sounds best in the green wood,
said the bird, but still she came willingly when she heard the emperor's wish. The palace was elegantly decorated for the occasion. The walls and floors of porcelain glittered in the light of 1,000 lamps. Beautiful flowers, round which little bells were tied, stood in the corridors. What with the running to and fro on the draught, these bells tinkled so loudly that no one could speak to be heard. In the center of the great hall, a golden perch had been fixed for the nightingale to sit on. The whole court was present, and the little kitchen maid had received permission to stand by the door. She was not installed as a real court cook. All were in full dress, and every eye was turned to the little gray bird when the emperor nodded for her to begin. The nightingale sang so sweetly that the tears came into the emperor's eyes and then rolled down his cheeks as her song became still more touching and went to everyone's heart. The emperor was so delighted that he declared the nightingale should have his gold slipper to wear round her neck, but she declined the honor with thanks. She had been sufficiently rewarded already.
I have seen tears in the Emperor's eyes,
she said.
That is my richest reward. An emperor's tears have wonderful power and are quite sufficient honor for me.
And then she sang again, more enchantingly than ever.
That singing is a lovely gift,
said the ladies of the court to each other, and then they took water in their mouths to make them utter the gurgling sounds of the nightingale when they spoke to anyone, so that they might fancy themselves nightingales. And the footmen and the chambermaids also expressed their satisfaction, which is saying a great deal, for they are very difficult to please. In fact, the nightingale's visit was most successful. She was now to remain at the court, to have her own cage, with liberty to go out twice a day and once during the night. 12 servants were appointed to attend her on these occasions, who each held her by a silken string fastened to her leg. There was certainly not much pleasure in this kind of flying. The whole city spoke of the wonderful bird, and when two people met, one said, "Nightin," and the other said, "Gale," and they understood what was meant, for nothing else was talked of. 11 peddlers' children were named after her, but none of them could sing a note. One day, the emperor received a large packet on which was written, "The Nightingale."
"Here is no doubt a new book about our celebrated bird,"
said the emperor. But instead of a book, it was a work of art contained in a casket, an artificial nightingale made to look like a living one, and covered all over with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. As soon as the artificial bird was wound up, it could sing like the real one, and could move its tail up and down, which sparkled with silver and gold. Round its neck hung a piece of ribbon, on which was written, The Emperor of Japan's nightingale is poor compared with that of the Emperor of China's." "This is very beautiful," exclaimed all who saw it, and he who had brought the artificial bird received the title of Imperial Nightingale Bringer-in-Chief. "Now they must sing together," said the court, "and what a duet it will be!" But they did not get on well, for the real nightingale sang in its own natural way, but the artificial bird sang only waltzes.
"That is not a fault,"
said the music master.
"it is quite perfect to my taste."
So then it had to sing alone, and was as successful as the real bird. Besides, it was so much prettier to look at, for it sparkled like bracelets and breastpins. 33 times did it sing the same tunes without being tired. The people would gladly have heard it again, but the emperor said the living nightingale ought to sing something. But where was she? No one had noticed her when she flew out the open window back to her own green woods. "What a strange conduct," said the emperor when her flight had been discovered, and all the courtiers blamed her and said that she was a very ungrateful creature.
"But we have the best bird after all,"
said one, and then they would have the birds sing again, although it was the 34th time they had listened to the same piece, and even then they had not learnt it, for it was rather difficult. But the music master praised the bird in the highest degree, and even asserted that it was better than a real nightingale, not only in its dress and the beautiful diamonds, but also in its musical power.
"For you must perceive, my chief lord and emperor, that with a real nightingale we can never tell what is going to be sung. But with this bird everything is settled. It can be opened and explained, so that people may understand how the waltzes are formed, and why one note follows upon another." "This is exactly what we think,"
they all replied, and the music master received permission to exhibit the bird to the people on the following Sunday, and the emperor commanded that they should be present to hear it sing. When they heard it, they were like people intoxicated. However, it must have been with drinking tea, which is quite a Chinese custom. They all said, "Oh!" and held up their forefingers and nodded. But a poor fisherman who had heard the real nightingale said,
"It sounds prettily enough, and the melodies are all alike, yet there seems something wanting. I cannot exactly tell what."
And after this, the real nightingale was banished from the empire, and the artificial bird placed on a silk cushion close to the emperor's bed. The presents of gold and precious stones which had been received with it were round the bird, and it was now advanced to the title of Little Imperial Toilet Singer, and to the rank of number 1 on the left hand, for the emperor considered the left side, on which the heart lies, as the most noble, and the heart of an emperor is in the same place as that of other people. The music master wrote a work in 25 volumes about the artificial bird, which was very learned and very long, and full of the most difficult Chinese words. Yet all the people said that they had read it and understood it, for fear of being thought stupid and having their bodies trampled upon. So a year passed, and the emperor, the court, and all the other Chinese people knew every little turn in the artificial bird's song, and for that same reason it pleased them better. They could sing with the bird, which they often did. The street boys sang,
"Zee, zee, zee, cluck, cluck, cluck,"
and the emperor himself could sing it also. It was really most amusing. One evening, when the artificial bird was singing its best, and the emperor lay in bed listening to it. Something inside the bird sounded, "Wuzz," and then a spring cracked. Went all the wheels running round, and then the music stopped. The emperor immediately sprang out of bed and called for his physician, but what could he do? Then they sent for a watchmaker, and after a great deal of talking and examination, the bird was put into something like order. But he said that it must be used very carefully, as the barrels were worn, and it would be impossible to put in new ones without injuring the music. Now there was a great sorrow, as the bird could only be allowed to play once a year, and even that was dangerous for the works inside of it. Then the music master made a little speech full of hard words, and declared that the bird was as good as ever, and of course no one contradicted him. 5 years passed, and then a real grief came upon the land. The Chinese people were very fond of their emperor, and he now lay so ill that he was not expected to live. Already a new emperor had been chosen, and the people who stood in the street asked the lord-in-waiting how the old emperor was, but he only said, "Pugh," and shook his head. Cold and pale lay the emperor in his royal bed. The whole court thought that he was dead, and everyone ran away to pay homage to his successor. The chamberlains went out to have a talk on the matter, and the ladies' maids invited company to take coffee. Cloth had been laid down on the halls and passages, so that not a footstep should be heard, and all was silent and still. But the emperor was not yet dead, although he lay white and stiff on his gorgeous bed, with the long velvet curtains and heavy gold tassels. A window stood open, and the moon shone in upon the emperor and the artificial bird. The poor emperor, finding he could scarcely breathe with a strange weight on his chest, opened his eyes, and he saw Death sitting there. He had put on the emperor's golden crown, and held in one hand his sword of slate, and in the other his beautiful banner. All around the bed, and peeping through the long velvet curtains, were a number of strange heads, some very ugly, and others lovely and gentle-looking. These were the emperor's good and bad deeds, which stared him in the face now, as Death sat at his heart.
Do you remember this? Do you recollect that? Do you remember this? Do you?
They asked one after the other, thus bringing to his remembrance circumstances that made the perspiration stand on his brow.
"I know nothing about it," said the emperor. "Music! Music!" he cried. "The large Chinese drum, that I may not hear what they say."
But they still went on, and Death nodded to all they said.
"Music! Music!"
shouted the emperor.
"You precious golden bird, sing, pray, sing! I have given you gold and costly presents. I have even hung my golden slipper around your neck. Sing, sing!"
But the bird remained silent. There was no one to wind it up, and therefore it could not sing a note. Death continued to stare at the emperor with his cold, hollow eyes, and the room was fearfully still. Suddenly, there came through the open window the sound of sweet music. Outside, on the bough of a tree, sat the living Nightingale. She had heard of the emperor's illness, and was therefore come to sing to him of hope and trust. And as she sung, the shadows grew paler and paler. The blood in the emperor's veins flowed more rapidly, and gave life to his weak limbs, and even Death himself listened and said, "Go on, little Nightingale, go on."
Then will you give me the beautiful golden sword and that rich banner? And will you give me the emperor's crown?
said the bird. So Death gave up each of these treasures for a song, and the nightingale continued her singing. She sung of the quiet churchyard where the white roses grow, where the elder tree wafts its perfume on the breeze, and the fresh, sweet grass is moistened by the mourner's tears. Then Death longed to go and see his garden, and floated out through the window in the form of a cold, white mist.
Thanks, thank you, you heavenly bird. I know you well. I banished you from my kingdom once, and yet you have charmed away the evil faces from my bed, and banished death from my heart with your sweet song. How can I reward you?
You have already rewarded me,
said the nightingale.
I shall never forget that I drew tears from your eyes the first time I sang to you. These are the jewels that rejoice a singer's heart. But now sleep and grow strong and well again. I will sing to you again.
And as she sung, the emperor fell into a sweet sleep, and how mild and refreshing that slumber was. When he awoke, strengthened and restored, the sun shone brightly through the window, but not one of his servants had returned. They all believed that he was dead. Only the nightingale still sat beside him and sang.
You must always remain with me,
said the emperor.
You shall sing only when it pleases you, and I will break the artificial bird into 1,000 pieces.
No, do not do that,
replied the nightingale.
The bird did very well as long as it could. Keep it here still. I cannot live in a palace and build my nest, but let me come when I like. I will sit on a bough outside your window in the evening and sing to you, so that you may be happy and have thoughts full of joy. I will sing to you of those who are happy and those who suffer, of the good and the evil who are hidden around you. The little singing bird flies far from you and your court to the home of the fisherman and the peasant's cot. I love your heart better than your crown, and yet something holy lingers round that also. I will come. I will sing to you, but you must promise me one thing.
Everything,
said the emperor, who, having dressed himself in his imperial robes, stood with the hand that held the heavy golden sword pressed to his heart.
I only ask one thing, she replied. Let no one know that you have a little bird who tells you everything. It will be best to conceal it.
So saying, the nightingale flew away. The servants now came in to look after the dead emperor, when lo, there he stood, and to their astonishment said,
Good morning.
The Top and Ball. A whipping top and a little ball lay together in a box, among other toys, and the top said to the ball,
Shall we be married as we live in the same box?
But the ball, which wore a dress of Morocco leather, and thought as much of herself as any other young lady, would not even condescend to reply. The next day came the little boy to whom the playthings belonged, and he painted the top red and yellow, and drove a brass-headed nail into the middle, so that while the top was spinning around it looked splendid.
Look at me, said the top to the ball. What do you say now? Shall we be engaged to each other? We should suit so well. You spring and I dance. No one could be happier than we should be. Indeed, do you think so? Perhaps you do not know that my father and mother were Morocco slippers and that I have a Spanish cork in my body. Yes, but I'm made of mahogany, said the top. The Major himself turned me. He has a turning lathe of his own, and it is a great amusement to him. Can I believe it? Asked the ball. May I never be whipped again, said the top, if I am not telling you the truth. You certainly know how to speak for yourself very well, said the ball, but I cannot accept your proposal. I am almost engaged to a swallow. Every time I fly up in the air, he puts his head out of the nest and says, "Will you?" And I have said, "Yes," to myself, silently, and that is as good as being half engaged. But I will promise never to forget you. Much good that will be to me, said the top, and they spoke to each other no more. Next day, the ball was taken out by the boy. The top saw it flying high in the air, like a bird, till it could go quite out of sight. Each time it came back, as it touched the earth, it gave a higher leap than before, either because it longed to fly upwards or from having a Spanish cork in its body. But the 9th time it rose into the air, it remained away and did not return. The boy searched everywhere for it, but he searched in vain, for it could not be found. It was gone. I know very well where she is, sighed the top. She is in the swallow's nest, and has married the swallow. The more the top thought of this, the more he longed for the ball. His love increased the more, just because he could not get her, and that she should have been won by another was the worst of all. The top still twirled about and hummed, but he continued to think of the ball, and the more he thought of her, the more beautiful she seemed to his fancy. Thus several years passed by, and his love became quite old. The top, also, was no longer young, but there came a day when he looked handsomer than ever, for he was gilded all over. He was now a golden top, and whirled and danced about until he hummed quite loud, and was something worth looking at. But one day he leapt too high, and then he also was gone. They searched everywhere, even in the cellar, but he was nowhere to be found. Where could he be? He had jumped into the dustbin, where all sorts of rubbish were lying. Cabbage stalks, dust, and rain droppings that had fallen down from the gutter under the roof. Now I am in a nice place, said he. My gilding will soon be washed off here. Oh dear, what a set of rabble I have gotten amongst. And then he glanced at the curious round thing like an old apple, which lay near a long, leafless cabbage stalk. It was, however, not an apple, but an old ball, which had lain for years in the gutter, and was soaked through with water. Thank goodness, here comes one of my own class, with whom I can talk, said the ball, examining the gilded top. I am made of Morocco, she said. I was sewn together by a young lady, and I have a Spanish cork in my body, but no one would think it to look at me now. I was once engaged to a swallow, but I fell in here from the gutter under the roof, and I have lain here more than 5 years, and have become thoroughly drenched. Believe me, it is a long time for a young maiden. The top said nothing, but he thought of his old love, and the more she said, the more clear it became to him that this was the same ball. The servant then came to clean out the dustbin. Ah,
she exclaimed.
Here is a gilt top.
So the top was brought again to notice and honor, but nothing more was heard of the little ball. He spoke not a word about his old love, for that soon died away. When the beloved object has lain for 5 years in the gutter and has been drenched through, no one cares to know her again on meeting her in a dustbin. The Red Shoes. Once upon a time there was a little girl, pretty and dainty, but in summertime she was obliged to go barefooted because she was poor, and in winter she had to wear large wooden shoes so that her instep grew quite red. In the middle of the village lived an old shoemaker's wife. She sat down and made, as well as she could, a pair of little shoes out of some old pieces of red cloth. They were clumsy, but she meant well, for they were intended for the little girl, whose name was Karen. Karen received the shoes and wore them for the first time on the day of her mother's funeral. They were certainly not suitable for mourning, but she had no others, and so she put her bare feet into them and walked behind the humble coffin. Just then, a large old carriage came by, and in it sat an old lady. She looked at the little girl, and taking pity on her, said to the clergyman,
Look here, if you will give me the little girl, I will take care of her.
Karen believed that this was all on account of the red shoes, but the old lady thought them hideous, and so they were burnt. Karen herself was dressed very neatly and cleanly. She was taught to read and to sew, and people said that she was pretty, but the mirror told her,
You are more than pretty. You are beautiful.
One day the queen was traveling through that part of the country and had her little daughter, who was a princess, with her. All the people, amongst them Karen too, streamed towards the castle, where the little princess, in fine white clothes, stood before the window and allowed herself to be stared at. She wore neither a train nor a golden crown, but beautiful red Moroccan shoes. They were indeed much finer than those which the shoemaker's wife had sewn for little Karen. There is really nothing in the world that can be compared to red shoes. Karen was now old enough to be confirmed. She received some new clothes, and she was also to have some new shoes. The rich shoemaker in the town took the measure of her little foot in his own room, in which there stood great glass cases full of pretty shoes and white slippers. It all looked very lovely, but the old lady could not see very well, and therefore did not get much pleasure out of it. Amongst the shoes stood a pair of red ones, like those which the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! And the shoemaker said that they had been made for a count's daughter, but that they had not fitted her.
I suppose they are of shiny leather?
Asked the old lady.
Oh, they shine so. Yes, they do shine,
said Karen. They fitted her and were bought. But the old lady knew nothing of their being red, for she would never have allowed Karen to be confirmed in red shoes, as she was now to be. Everybody looked at her feet, and the whole of the way from the church door to the choir, it seemed to her as if even the ancient figures on the monuments, in their stiff collars and long black robes, had their eyes fixed on her red shoes. It was only of these that she had thought when the clergyman laid his hand upon her head and spoke of the holy baptism, of the covenant with God, and told her that she was now to be a grown-up Christian. The organ pealed forth solemnly, and the sweet children's voices mingled with that of their old leader, but Karen thought only of her red shoes. In the afternoon, the old lady heard from everybody that Karen had worn red shoes. She said that it was a shocking thing to do, that it was very improper, and that Karen was always to go to church in the future in black shoes, even if they were old. On the following Sunday, there was communion. Karen looked first at the black shoes, then at the red ones, looked at the red ones again, and put them on. The sun was shining gloriously, so Karen and the old lady went along the footpath through the corn, where it was rather dusty. At the church door stood an old crippled soldier leaning on a crutch. He had a wonderfully long beard, more red than white, and he bowed down to the ground and asked the old lady whether he might wipe her shoes. Then Karen put out her little foot too.
"Dear me, what pretty dancing shoes," said the soldier. "Sit fast when you dance,"
said he, addressing the shoes and slapping the soles with his hand. The old lady gave the soldier some money and then went with Karen into the church. And all the people inside looked at Karen's red shoes, and all the figures gazed at them. When Karen knelt before the altar and put the golden goblet to her mouth, she thought only of the red shoes. It seemed to her as though they were swimming about in the goblet, and she forgot to sing the psalm, forgot to say the Lord's Prayer. Now everyone came out of church, and the old lady stepped into her carriage. But just as Karen was lifting up her foot to get in too, the old soldier said,
"Dear me, what pretty dancing shoes!"
And Karen could not help it. She was obliged to dance a few steps. And when she had once begun, her legs continued to dance. It seemed as if the shoes had got power over them. She danced round the church corner, for she could not stop. The coachman had to run after her and seize her. He lifted her into the carriage, but her feet continued to dance, so that she kicked the good old lady violently. At last they took off her shoes, and her legs were at rest. At home, the shoes were put into the cupboard, but Karen could not help looking at them. Now the old lady fell ill, and it was said that she would not rise from her bed again. She had to be nursed and waited upon, and this was no one's duty more than Karen's. But there was a grand ball in the town, and Karen was invited. She looked at the red shoes, saying to herself that there was no sin in doing that. She put the red shoes on, thinking that there was no harm in that either, and then she went to the ball and commenced to dance. But when she wanted to go to the right, the shoes danced to the left, and when she wanted to dance up the room, the shoes danced down the room, down the stairs, through the street, and out through the gates of the town. She danced, and was obliged to dance, far out into the dark wood. Suddenly, something shone up among the trees, and she believed it was the moon, for it was a face, but it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there nodding his head and said,
"Dear me, what pretty dancing shoes!"
She was frightened and wanted to throw the red shoes away, but they stuck fast. She tore off her stockings, but the shoes had grown fast to her feet. She danced and was obliged to go on dancing over field and meadow, in rain and sunshine, by night and by day. But by night it was most horrible. She danced out into the open churchyard, but the dead there did not dance. They had something better to do than that. She wanted to sit down on the pauper's grave where the bitter fern grows, but for her there was neither peace nor rest. And as she danced past the open church door, she saw an angel there in long white robes, with wings reaching from his shoulders down to the earth. His face was stern and grave, and in his hand he held a broad, shining sword.
"Dance you shall,"
said he.
"Dance in your red shoes till you are pale and cold, till your skin shrivels up and you are a skeleton. Dance you shall, from door to door, and where proud and wicked children live, you shall knock, so that they may hear you and fear you. Dance you shall. Dance!
Mercy!
cried Karen, but she did not hear what the angel answered, for the shoes carried her through the gate, into the fields, along highways and byways, and unceasingly she had to dance. One morning she danced past a door that she knew well. They were singing a psalm inside, and a coffin was being carried out, covered with flowers. Then she knew that she was forsaken by everyone and damned by the angel of God. She danced and was obliged to go on dancing through the dark night. The shoes bore her away over thorns and stumps till she was all torn and bleeding. She danced away over the heath to a lonely little house. Here she knew lived the executioner, and she tapped with her finger at the window and said,
Come out, come out. I cannot come in, for I must dance.
And the executioner said,
I don't suppose you know who I am. I strike off the heads of the wicked, and I notice that my axe is tingling to do so.
Don't cut off my head,
said Karen,
for then I could not repent of my sin. But cut off my feet with the red shoes.
And then she confessed all her sin, and the executioner struck off her feet with the red shoes, but the shoes danced away with the little feet across the field into the deep forest. And he carved her a pair of wooden feet and some crutches, and taught her a psalm which is always sung by sinners. She kissed the hand that guided the axe, and went away over the heath.
Now I have suffered enough for the red shoes,
she said.
I will go to church so that people can see me.
And she went quickly up to the church door. But when she came there, the red shoes were dancing before her, and she became frightened and then turned back. During the whole week she was sad, and wept many bitter tears. But when Sunday came again, she said,
Now I have suffered and striven enough. I believe I am quite as good as many of those who sit in church and give themselves airs.
And so she went boldly on, but she had not got farther than the churchyard gate when she saw the red shoes dancing along before her. Then she became terrified and turned back and repented right heartily of her sin. She went to the parsonage and begged that she might be taken into service there. She would be industrious, she said, and do everything that she could. She did not mind about the wages as long as she had a roof over her and was with good people. The pastor's wife had pity on her and took her into a service, and she was industrious and thoughtful. She sat quiet and listened when the pastor read out loud from the Bible in the evening. All the children liked her very much, but when they spoke about dress and grandeur and beauty, she would shake her head. On the following Sunday, they all went to the church, and she was asked whether she wished to go too, but, with tears in her eyes, she looked sadly at her crutches. And then the others went to hear God's word, but she went alone into her little room. This was only large enough to hold the bed and a chair. Here she sat down with her hymn book, and as she was reading it with a pious mind, the wind carried the notes of the organ over to her from the church, and in tears she lifted up her face and said,
Oh God, help me!
Then the sun shone so brightly, and right before her stood an angel of God in white robes. It was the same one whom she had seen that night at the church door. He no longer carried the sharp sword, but a beautiful green branch, full of roses. With this, he touched the ceiling, which rose up very high, and where he touched it, there shone a golden star. He touched the walls, which opened wide apart, and she saw the organ which was pealing forth. She saw the pictures of the old pastors and their wives, and the congregation sitting in the polished chairs and singing from their hymn books. The church itself had come to the poor girl in her narrow room, or the room had gone to the church. She sat in the pew with the rest of the pastor's household, and when they had finished the hymn and looked up, they nodded and said, "It was right of you to come, Karen."
"It was mercy,"
said she. The organ played, and the children's voices in their choir sounded soft and lovely. The bright, warm sunshine streamed through the window into the pew where Karen sat, and her heart became so filled with it, so filled with peace and joy, that it broke. Her soul flew on the sunbeams to heaven, and no one was there who asked after the red shoes. This brings the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, Volume 9, to a close. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for listening. Please don't forget to set your notifications so you're aware of each upcoming installment that comes out. Please share our channel with your friends and family. And also, please make sure that you're subscribed to our channel. Thank you all very much. We appreciate you, and we're glad that you're spending your time with us. Take care of yourselves. Sweet dreams.